In this video, I'll tell you why I think that headcanon is better than lore in wargaming. Humans love stories. This is something that's been true since, caveman days. And it's still just as true as it's ever been. Look at the number of shows and movies and comics and novels and all that stuff out there. They're generally all stories to varying degrees. Now, some of them are just a series of explosions over and over and over again that make up an action movie, but that's neither here nor there. Storytelling is intrinsic to the human condition. And unsurprisingly, it's pretty much intrinsic to tabletop wargaming as well. Story is pretty important to pushing little toy soldiers around. The earliest wargaming was very much what we'd consider these days to be historical wargaming, but there was still plenty of story going on. The soldiers from this country were fighting the soldiers from this other country, and the reasons were generally well known to people who studied these battles throughout history, right? Like Visigoths versus Romans and Saxons versus Normans and stuff like that. And generally, fidelity to the original goings-on was pretty important. But nowadays, fantastical wargaming, like your fantasy, your sci-fi, pretty much everything in between, it's all the rage, right? Conflicts between forces that have never existed and battles that never happened. This is what makes up most of our wargaming. And don't get me wrong, I'm here for it. I personally prefer my wargaming battles to be battles that never actually happened. Real war, it's a terrible thing, and fantastic battles that never happened are less so. Almost all wargame rule sets have some sort of story involved. It takes the game out of the abstract and gives your brain something a little bit more to latch onto, right? The amount of story depends upon the people that are making the game. Like, the entire story might just be in the title. Look at Space Weirdos. Pretty much what it says on the tin. There's no lore in the game, but the title itself spurs me on to create models and scenarios and stories for my games of Space Weirdos. And that's the beginnings of headcanon. No, not that kind of headcanon. The first definition of the word canon is a general rule, law, principle, or criterion by which something is judged. The second definition on here is a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine. So when we talk about canon for something that didn't really happen, a made-up story that's attached to our wargame rule sets, for example, what we're talking about is generally an inflexible set of touch points and happenings that make up that story. And to me, that's just not very interesting. Now, headcanon, though, the definition is a word used in fandom that refers to something a fan imagines about the characters and circumstances, but that doesn't appear on the screen or the page. This is the interesting thing in wargaming. Sure, I love the hobby aspects like building and painting, and I love playing games with my forces as well, but both of those things are intrinsically tied to story, generally the story in my head. Headcanon. The reason I'm having a great time building the models the way that I want and painting them the way that I want is because of the stories I'm making up in my head while the glue or the paint or whatever is still drying. Most of my headcanon comes to me while I'm actually hobbying, while I'm doing it. What's my color scheme going to be for these models? Why am I outfitting them with these particular weapons or these particular accessories? Like, even if I'm following a known faction, like the Blood Angels, for example, from Warhammer 40,000, I'm still differing from the norm for my own story. And the way that I play my games, from how I build my lists to my strategies actually on the board during play, they frequently come from headcanon as well. These models here have a kind of ragtag survivalist sci-fi look to them, so I'm going to play them cautiously and try to use guerrilla tactics, whereas these Imperial Guard will be much more regimented, and this doesn't really depend upon the rules. This can be like this with whatever rule set you choose. Sometimes the story in a wargame is just the title, and you get to make up the rest. And sometimes there's a little bit more. When Vince and I make games, we generally put 2 pages or less of lore in them, enough to let you know about the world and what's going on, and then your headcanon gets to take over and you construct the rest however you see fit. And then there's, well, other games, and all of the books. Some wargame systems hit you with so much lore, just tons and tons and tons of it. Games Workshop makes about a half to 2/3 of each of their rule books just lore. Just that's what makes up most of the rule books. And then, of course, there's the novels, of which there are legion, right? I'm not saying that this is bad, honestly. It's obviously a huge selling point for their games. It gets people very, very invested and interested. And it's not just them either. Battletech, off the top of my head, does the same type of thing. Tons of lore in the rule books, and also scores and scores of novels, too. It gets many people very invested into these games. I've read bunches of Black Library novels from Games Workshop. Honestly, most of them don't do much for me. My favorites are the Eisenhorn series and the Ravnor series, both of them Inquisitors, and there's like multiple books within each series. Both of those series are by Dan Abnett. I think it's because of the interpersonal relationships and interactions between the Inquisitors and their retinues. That seems to be kind of what holds my interest. Many of the other books have a tendency to slide into what's known as, very frequently, bolter porn, which isn't what you think. What it is it's just pages and pages and pages of descriptions of dudes shooting each other. And I just don't find text descriptions of fighting to be very compelling, personally. Now, if you like these books, there's nothing wrong with that. We're reasonable people on the internet, and we can like different things. I'm sure there's stuff out there, like books and movies and music or whatever, stuff that I like that you wouldn't enjoy either. It's okay. We can differ on that. The issue that I find being problematic with lore in wargaming, like canon, if you will, is when people become inflexible and say that this is the only way that the story can be, and anyone who disagrees is wrong. Just because the Ultramarines aren't blue in the lore, and honestly, well, in the name, it doesn't mean that yours have to be, right? Like in games like Warhammer 40,000, which have years and years of lore behind it, you don't have to follow the paint schemes in the books. No one can tell you that your figures aren't correct because the colors aren't right according to the lore. You get to do whatever you want in this hobby, and that's what makes it great. Creativity. Why do you think that custom chapters are so popular for Space Marines in Warhammer 40,000? Some people love to be creative and do their own thing, headcanon, and it's like totally legal to do so. But you don't even have to make up a custom chapter just so you can paint and model however you want. If you love Space Wolves, but you also love painting black armor, make yourself some black armored Space Wolves. No one can stop you, though they might think so. There's a slightly derogatory term out there in the historical wargaming world. A person known as a rivet counter is someone who has like an obsession with the minutia of their particular interest, predominantly in like military historical wargaming. They'll tell you, unsolicited in most situations, that your tank markings aren't period correct or that the color of your soldiers' trousers isn't right, that kind of stuff. They might be technically correct, but A, it's a game, not a museum diorama, and 2, you didn't ask them. As it turns out, there are folks like this in fantastical wargaming as well. Obviously, pretty much only in the game systems with decades and decades of lore to pull from, of course. They'll tell you that your chapter markings aren't right. Wrong shoulder pads, wrong knee pads, whatever, all kinds of stuff like that. They'll tell you that your bolters aren't painted the proper color or like whatever. All for a game that portrays people and events that didn't actually exist ever, right? Like they lean so much into the lore as written by these companies that they don't seem to appreciate the creativity of what should be inherent in the wargaming hobby. If you want to build and paint an army exactly the way it is in the books, you love doing all of the research and getting all the right parts together and all the water slide decals and like all of that stuff, that's great. It's awesome that makes you happy and you should have a great time with it, honestly. However, if someone else has their own headcanon for their army and their builds and they paint it however they want and all that kind of stuff, then that's also a great thing and they shouldn't be criticized for doing what they want with their toy soldiers. There are no rules in wargaming. Well, no, I mean there are actually rules like that. That's what the game is made out of, rules. But even those rules can be easily changed as long as you and your opponent agree on it, right? But what I mean is there are absolutely no rules in the hobby side of wargaming. The building and the painting and you making, enjoying your own headcanon, all that stuff, there's no rules there. So you can feel free to do whatever you want with your models that makes you feel happy. And if someone tells you that you're doing it wrong, they should probably find somebody else to play with. I see new players ask all the time, generally online and stuff like that, if they're painting it right because they think that there's a specific rule way that they have to do it, right? So I hope that this video helps. But this video isn't just for new players. I hope it resonates with veterans as well. If you liked this video, please share it with folks that might need to see it. And then also, hit the like button down below. It helps and you get little tiny fireworks, which are always fun. I'm not kidding. There's little tiny fireworks, at least, on the web version. Also subscribe if you would like to see more. Thanks for watching.